Hello, my name is Chris McGee, and I'm here today to tell you a little bit about Zotero. What is Zotero? Zotero is citation management software. It can help you with collecting and managing your sources for your many different types of assignments and papers and essays and whatnot that you're going to encounter in that broader world of higher education. It can help you organize those sources, always a good thing. It can help you cite your papers, which is probably the thing that most people are very excited to hear. And hopefully that will be the most exciting part of the entire presentation. And building your own growing personal library. This may not be quite as exciting because, well, you'd think that's your librarian's job, but no, it's for you as well, especially for those higher level programs, your masters, your PhDs, because everything you find and are forced to read is honestly a source for the next paper. But that's something for you to discuss with your professor. So what are we going to cover today? Installing Zotero, how to add material to your Zotero library, how to organize your Zotero library, creating those lovely in-text and bibliographic citations, as well as how to sync and create group libraries if one is so inclined. Those are some of the more advanced features. The good news about installation is Zotero is free. Hopefully now and forever. You do not have to register with Zotero, but you should, especially if you are interested in the advanced features like syncing and group libraries. Zotero works with Microsoft Word and Google Docs. It also works with web browsers like Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari. In order to get the most out of Zotero and to get the full functionality you're going to see today, it is required that you install both pieces of Zotero. One piece is the primary program, the other is a plugin for your browser. As Zotero installs, it will add a plugin to things like Microsoft Word to allow that later functionality. But let's actually see where these things are. You should see before you Zotero's website, zotero.org. On this page, you should see, without too much difficulty, a nice red download button. That is where we want to go. When you click on this button, you are going to be taken to the download page. And this, oddly enough, has both pieces of Zotero that you will want to download and install. The web page should detect what browser you're using, what operating system you are using, and give you the appropriate choices. As we can see here on the left, I'm on a Windows computer. It is giving me the option for Zotero 7 for Windows. That's the first piece. Get that. Download the installer, run the installer, good times there. The second piece is right next to it. This is the connector. This is the piece that lives inside of your browser. If you've ever had any kind of browser extension, this is what we're talking about. This allows some very fun features that I will describe later, and it's going to live in this part of your browser. Right now, I'm in the Google Chrome browser. This is the one that I find has the least number of problems with Zotero, and that little puzzle piece is where you will find all of the different plugins, but specifically the Zotero plugin. And once everything is installed, this is what Zotero looks like. Not the prettiest piece of software, but honestly, it does a lot of work. It's quite functional. I will admit, however, it is a little bit different than many other programs you may have encountered. Now, back to the presentation slides. Source collecting, getting stuff into Zotero. So at this point, we have Zotero installed, and it's just rather empty. It's like iTunes circa 2008, 2009. Yeah, it's great, but if there's no music in there, what's the point? So we have four significant ways of adding material to Zotero. Manual entry. If you've ever done data entry work before, you are painfully aware what I'm talking about. It's no one's best option, but it works. That's all that really matters. Unique identifiers. If you are familiar with things like DOI, PMID, archive, other unique little bits that you might find on a lot of pieces of information out there, pop those in. Zotero can reach out through the network to a reputable source and get the full record. Those are all nice and all, but those don't actually add the full text most of the time. Open access is a thing, it's complicated. Ask your librarian about that. The most common option you're going to engage with is your browser, using that little plugin to grab material from our databases as you discover it. And finally, if you already have PDFs of material you've already found, you can usually drop those in, and assuming it is a PDF file of a certain format and type, usually with OCR data and recognizable unique identifiers, Zotero can find the record and build it for you. I'm going to show you those first three: manual entry, unique identifiers, and grabbing stuff through our browser. All right, manual entry, no one's favorite. So to engage with creating an item manually, you'll open Zotero. Currently it's up right now on my screen, and I'm going to go to this little box with the little plus sign. That is the add item button or new item button. If you click on it, you're going to get at the top what I would describe as the usual suspects of format: book, book chapter, journal, article, things of that nature. And below, you will see a pretty robust list of different kinds of material. This is not a comprehensive list of the different kinds of things you might ultimately try to cite. When in doubt, contact your librarian. Document is a good stand-in for most things, but for the sake of demonstration, we are going to engage with a book. I'm going to pretend that I wrote a book being published. It's a big deal. Once I select book from that little new item dropdown, I'm going to have a couple of things happening. The first is I will have a new line in the center field of Zotero with a small icon roughly approximating the thing that I've chosen. And on the right, I will have a form that is waiting for me to fill it in. Thus, the joy of data entry begins. I'm going to start adding in things like, well, this is clearly an awesome book. I wrote it after all. I can use the tab key to cycle through the different fields. And if you're not sure about how much information you really need to add, double check your style guide, whether it's APA, MLA, Chicago, IEEE, whatever. There are literally thousands of these things. Double check. Most things don't ask for too much, especially for books. This is one of the more established format types, and in turn, more standardized in terms of the kind of information that it wants. There we go. Sometimes you might find that you need to add additional information, and it's not really clear right away how to add stuff. So, for example, if you have additional authors, next to the author line, you have things like a plus and minus. So you can add another author or other forms of contribution, just a contributor, an editor, a translator. We add these things in because that counts. Translation work, don't trust the online tools, especially when you want more meaningful translations. Give credit where credit's due, always a good idea. Sometimes you don't necessarily want to add a person, but you want to add an entity, an organization, or for some things, you don't have a specific author. This little odd rectangle, actually draw a little arrow to that to make it a little bit more clear because it's tiny. It's right about there. Aha, close enough. I can change the name to a single field. In practice, that's great for an organizational name. So let's say this awesome book was also written by George Mason University. Why not? Perfectly fine. Now, this does not add the full text. This doesn't do anything other than what I've put in. So depending upon the nature of the thing, add in as much information as you reasonably have. If you're not sure, ask. Does anybody like this particular option? Generally speaking, no. But when it works, it's really, really, really convenient. But what else do we have? Well, next to that little boxy thing, we have, well, that's a wand, or it's supposed to be a wand. Icons are hard, man. It's fine. Okay, so if you click on this little wand, you will get an entry field with a wide variety of bits of information that you can put in. ISBN, International Standard Book Number, DOI, Digital Object Identifier, and so on and so on. If you have that piece of information, you can just pop it in. So I'm going to grab a book off of my desk, and I'm going to type in the ISBN. 978-006-231-6110. Did I actually type that in correctly? Please don't betray me. I don't want to have to re-record this. Are you working? I have to pause this. No, hey, all right, cool. So that was real time. I didn't actually have to pause it. Here we can see a relatively new book, and all the information on the right is the information that Zotero went out and acquired for me. It not only got the title, the author, the edition, the place, the publisher, that's all really good stuff. The number of pages. I mean, I'm a librarian. I appreciate that piece of information. The vast majority of other people do not care about that. It also tells us where we got it, K10 plus, when it was added, and it honestly added a lot more information just because this is what Zotero does. Sometimes there's more information, sometimes there's less. I would have really liked the actual references and index in there, but it didn't give it to us. Whatever. The most important thing is the entry exists and it looks pretty good. Although the APA pain I've suffered before demands that that be a capital A. But okay, fine. Imperfect, but it's doing the good work. Manual entry, unique identifiers. But now let's talk about adding things in as we search through those online databases and resources. Let me get that set up for you. For us. Words are hard. All right. Everyone should now see EBSCO hosts academic search complete. Just point of it, this is just a pet peeve. This is an EBSCO host. That's the name of the company. The actual name of the tool that we are demoing at this point is Academic Search Complete. In terms of the platforms that Zotero works reasonably well with, EBSCO is fine, ProQuest is fine, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Sage, Wiley. Most of them play nice, but okay. So what do we do when we are in these databases? We're searching for what? For sources, for material, whatever. So at this point, I'm going to point out something and put a nice little arrow to show it off. That's Zotero. That is Zotero's plugin, its connector. Right now, and honestly, for most websites, it doesn't do anything. What it does is it reads the XML and HTML code to try and recognize certain arrangements of things and will start changing when it sees something that it recognizes. So let's do a search. Test and measures, always a good thing. Methodology is important. Okay, so I got 274,000 hits. That's not important. I'm looking at the little icon at the end of my red arrow in the upper right-hand corner. What was once a gray, sad little boxy thing is now a little yellow folder. That means Zotero sees something. That's how it's trying to communicate to us. And if I click on that folder, it's going to show us what it thinks it sees. It does not see all 274,000. It only sees what's on the current web page, top to bottom. And this is what it thinks it sees, these titles. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Some of our providers are a little testy about this, but I'm going to try and save a few things. And there it goes. And there you can see it's saving not only the entry, but that happy little red and gray and white icon we all know and love, the all-important PDF. We'll talk about that more in a second. Now, I will admit, saving things based on title is not my favorite because titles so often lie. It's complicated. I generally recommend looking at the full record. As a librarian in higher ed, this is very important to see more information about the thing, make a more informed decision about saving something, but that's not important right now because as I look at a single item, Zotero's icon changes yet again. Up in the upper right-hand corner, now it is a little white piece of paper to reflect what Zotero thinks is an article, a journal article, something along those lines, and I can click on that to just save the one thing. And there it goes. Again, this works with the vast majority of platforms. It even works with Google Scholar. It doesn't work with a regular Google search. Don't think I haven't tried. And ultimately, everything goes here. This would be enough of a reason to use Zotero by itself, having things in a single place without having to look through your downloads folder or something like that. You don't have to go through all the icons on your desktop. It manages this set of stuff. But okay, this is just step one because it can do some more for us. That's right, organization. Okay, so one thing that librarians do is organize and otherwise catalog material. It's back of the house. They're called catalogers, bibliographers. They're very introverted. You'll never meet them. We love the work that they do. So there are a number of ways to organize your sources in a more meaningful way to make your life a little bit easier, especially if you're in more than one class or dealing with more than one project. Keeping stuff at least halfway organized generally pays dividends in the future. First up, folders or collections. If you've ever made a playlist in any kind of music app or program, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Very, very useful. Highly recommend. They're the lowest labor, lowest effort thing you can do to make Zotero more worthwhile. You can add tags to things. If you ever add a hashtag in Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, then the idea should not be too striking there. You can add notes to things, little self-written things to describe why something's important, why it's meaningful. You can write a tiny bit, you can write a small treatise on things. It doesn't matter. And just reordering the list based on the options that Zotero has. Now, all this is just sounds great, but let's see what that actually means in practice. All right, so we're looking back at Zotero. We can see Epsco in the back. I've got some stuff, but let's assume that I'm working on a specific project for a specific class. I'm probably going to make a folder or collection for that specific class. So, I know I can put all the stuff for that class together in one place. Makes sense. So up here on the left-hand side, above the words My Library, is a little kind of outline of what looks like a folder with a little plus sign on it. If I click on this, I will get the option to name a new collection. I'll call it English 302 because George Mason University has a class called English 302. And if you're taking that class, you know you're in for just a ton of fun. And I've created a new folder. It'll show up on the left under My Library. This is a playlist. And if you've ever created a playlist, doesn't matter where, you now have to populate that playlist with the things you want to deal with. My library is my master list, my full catalog of all the stuff that I found, all the things that I've added in. And you know what? I just want the articles to go in. So I'm going to highlight those and drag them onto English 302. Nothing seems to have happened here. But when I look at English 302, there they are. Full list of everything, subset of the things that actually, I want to be looking at when I'm looking at English 302. Fancy, maybe. Easy, yes. You can have as many folders as you like. As far as I'm aware, I don't think anybody's really. If you really want to go nuts and just try and see how many folders you can actually make, go for it. I don't recommend it. You'll be there for a long time. Let's say you're taking another class. Maybe it's Crim 495, the capstone course. Well, I don't want it to be there. I'm going to move it back so it's on. Yeah, you can click and drag these. You can nest them. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. There's no specific let me rephrase. You get as much as you put into these things. If you only do this for like 5 minutes and then stop organizing, it's going to lose its value really fast. If you're pretty consistent about putting things in its proper folder, life will be a lot easier. All of your course readings, put them in there. Make another folder for all of the materials for a paper. Easy. This is the first and most common and definitely my most recommended way of organizing. But what's another option? Tags. On the right-hand side of Zotero, you can see this little colorful set of icons, including a little red icon that looks like the tag like you might see at a store or something like that. You might discover that some of the things in your library already have tags because this is how databases and libraries organize stuff. Like here are tags. Easy peasy. The effects of high stakes national education, blah, 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 blah. Sure. There it is. They're the tags. These are defined. They have meaning and purpose. And here's the fun part. You can add to them. You can use these in your searching. If you added something manually, there will be no tag. So I'm going to add a tag. Clearly, my book has an awesome theory. Sweet. Maybe I read the Sapiens book and it also talks about my awesome theory. Well, I'm going to add a tag. Cool. It auto-completed. If the tag's already in your library, it'll auto-complete to that tag. Nice, good stuff. And you might say, okay, what's the point of this? Well, later on, if I want to see everything that's talking about the awesome theory in my entire library, there you go. Quick, easy, not too bad. This is admittedly a back-loaded value effort. You're not going to see a lot of value for this right off the bat. You have to be using this for a little while and being really consistent with your tagging. But once you've done that, revisiting worthwhile material becomes very easy. Not quite as useful as the folders, the collections, but it has its value in turn. But now one of my absolute favorites, notes. Same kind of thing. It's on the right-hand side. It's this little kind of orange, yellow-ish looking thing. Notes, if I add a new note to my awesome book, it's basically a little word processing window. I mean, this is awfully self-serving for a book that I haven't even written yet, but the core conceit here is I can very quickly write down something important about the work. Why would I do this? Because titles are kind of bad. That's not fair. Titles don't always necessarily articulate the value of the thing. Why is this book or article or presentation or speech or whatever? Why is it important? Why do I care? Awesome theory is defined on page 419. Very important. Cite this later. That can be why. If you've ever had a research project, you found a bunch of stuff, then you did a bunch of other things, then you got back to the actual project and had to start writing, and then you realized you'd forgotten what the things that were important were, or where did you actually find that particular statistic, that particular bit of maybe a finding from an article, but damn it, which article was it? This can help you get back to that more meaningful stuff. Also, for the higher level students out there, if you've ever had to find the source of a theory, as it turns out, most articles that articulate a theory aren't named after the theory in question. They're named after something else entirely. This is incredibly irritating to try and track this kind of stuff down. It drives me nuts. So when you find the source of a theory, add the note. You will make yourself so much less angry in the future. Past me made some mistakes. Anyway, I've met faculty who will do reviews and they will write the review in their Zotero notes field, and then they'll just cut and paste it into a document. There are other people don't use these at all. Honestly, a little bit of work when it comes to organization can make your library very, very, very functional. If you don't want to, it's fine. If you have any questions, reach out to your librarians at your library, and we're going to help you out. Okay. What else we got? Citing and writing. This is the stuff that most of you are probably interested in. So we're going to cover two big things. One, citing as you write, mostly using Microsoft Word, whether we like it or not, and a way to just create a list without too much trouble. Both of these are mildly game-changing. They don't necessarily do all the work for you. They are not perfect, but ultimately, let's see how this actually works. And here we have, well, it's a blank Microsoft Word document. Many of us have been staring at this, and ultimately we feel like the machine is staring back into us, gazing upon our soul, daring us to put words on the screen. Totally understand that. But that's not important right now. Assuming everything has installed correctly in Microsoft Word, the local version, not the online 365 version or whatever, 360, whatever, local Microsoft Word program, you should have the Zotero plugin installed. If it's not there, reach out to your librarians. We will help you out. What does this do? This gives me a new set of commands that allows Word and Zotero to communicate to make my life just a little bit less bad. Zotero does need to be running. So, open it up, then minimize it, get it behind the Word document, whatever, easy enough. Everything that you're citing needs to be in Zotero beforehand. You can do other stuff later on, but this is just, you do your research, you do your reading, then you start writing. That's the ideal anyway. But okay, so let's put this into action. All right, I've started writing. It's good to have a positive view of your own research, but let's add in the all-important in-text citation. We're talking about something awesome. We wrote an awesome book, definitely a really awesome theory. Self-citing, some fields have very strong feelings about this, but I don't care. No one's going to stop me here. So let's add a citation. Here we can see the first command in the upper left-hand corner, add citation. This is exactly what it sounds like. We're going to add that all important citation. And the first thing we get to do is choose our style. This only affects the in-text citations and bibliography. And I'm a librarian. My field has long since been using APA. You can see there's a lot of other choices here. If you want to find out more about this, talk to your librarians. We grudgingly know quite a bit about this. And I will then get the red bar. The red bar is kind of a search that allows me to search my collection of materials, my library. And the red bar will also automatically show things that are highlighted in my library. So there's the awesome book. If I want to get away from that, try and do that again, nothing there. It's cool. But if I know who I'm citing or what I'm citing, I can type in the name or title, the name of the creator or the title into the red bar, and anything that matches will show up. I'm going to select that. I get kind of a little preview-ish thing here. This is where you can begin to add in specific notations. So if you click on that little kind of lavender-ish bubble, you can add things like page number. Depending upon the nature of the thing you're looking at, you can add in a lot of different kinds of information. Some pieces have different formats, different notations. If you're not sure, again, talk to your librarian. Prefix, suffix. Honestly admit, I've never had to deal with those. Don't worry about it. Omit author. This is a weird little thing. Oh, it went away. That omit author element, different styles have you omit the name of the author in the in-text citation if you mentioned it in the sentence preceding said in-text citation. I'm not teaching APA here. I'm teaching Zotero. Double check that stuff yourself. Ultimately, we got a nice thing going here, and there we are. A lovely, lovely in-text citation. Let's do another. Continue to write, continue to cite. Let's say, there we are, tests. Okay, cool. All right, nice and easy. Now you might notice that these in-text citations have this kind of odd gray highlighting around them. This is not my highlighting, that's something else. This is to inform you that this is a Zotero citation and it is not what it appears to be. It's actually a whole set of code and script, which means editing this directly could be bad. Don't do that. If you need to get rid of it, highlight the entire thing and maybe a little bit more. If you need to change anything or add anything, like maybe it wasn't 419, say maybe 449 or something. There you go. Do one more just for good measure. Now, the red bar has weakness. I don't memorize all of my sources. Okay, it's not its weakness, it's my weakness. So if I don't remember who or what I'm trying to cite, searching for it is maybe not as useful. However, I can click on this little red Z and go to something called Classic View. Why are you over here? Get over here. Here is kind of a miniature view of my library. I can look at my different collections, my different playlists, my different bunchings of stuff. I can search my tags like the awesome theory. Aha, there it is. So I can more effectively search for the thing that I want, and I can add in page numbers just as easily. No problem there. Okay, so let's assume for the moment that this is my paper. It's short, it's sweet, it's straight to the point. Super easy for my professor to grade. I am ready for my bibliography. Double check all of the rules of your style. Page breaks, headers, that's still on you, but let's assume everything is as it should be. Add bibliography. 1, 2, 3. Ta-da! This was awesome for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, and this is probably the thing that most of you are already looking at, it did it for me. And if you've ever done, so the first words, many of you who don't think this is amazing have yet to suffer. The first time you've done a 10-page paper with 20 sources, you realize that just finishing the 10-page paper is only the beginning. You now have somewhere between 4 and 10 hours of misery crafting all of your citations and making them look right. This really does matter. So the fact that it did this is a huge game changer. The fact that you need to have all your research done and everything in Zotero that's easy. But ultimately, it's doing that. The next thing it's doing, this is probably just as important, it's only adding things that I've actively cited in the body of my work. It's not adding random stuff. So if I don't see something here, well, rather, this is a great point to check your work. Did you cite all the things you intended to cite? Did you make all the arguments you intended to make? Did you give all the evidence you intended to give? Because this is not static. I can continue to write. I can continue to cite. I mean, don't write this, obviously make it work, add to the flow of the narrative. And I can add another citation. And I'm going to. Let's add something interesting. Let's add, yeah, let's add you. Okay. So now I added this, Del Pupo, last source. It's in its appropriate place in my bibliography. It's that easy. Or that straightforward. Easy is a terrible word. I don't like it. Anyway, now, this is where I will point out the weaknesses of Zotero because they're not paying me. So I am a librarian. My style is APA. This entry is technically incorrect or out of compliance with the rules and expectations of APA. How do I know this? Because I lost a letter grade on a graduate level paper for this nonsense, and I'm a little bit salty about it, even a decade on. So, what is the problem? Zotero makes one consistent mistake. In this case, it is the article title that is out of compliance with APA's rules. What is the rule? Article titles are expected to be in what is called sentence case. So as if you were writing a sentence, the rules that apply. So the first letter of the first word of the title, subtitle, proper noun, and acronym, those may be capitalized. End of the day, there's too many capital letters here. Does it matter? Strictly speaking, yes. So we're going to have to fix it. But we're not going to fix it in the document because this is also code, just like my in-text citations. And also, that's not where the problem is. The problem is here. The problem is right there. The title field. Okay, so Zotero, when it is collecting data, doesn't really care about the format. It's just collecting the material. It might fix some things, but ultimately, it will never fix everything. If you are dealing with APA or other styles that have a similar rule, you might be changing things to sentence case. Always double check the result. And once you've made any necessary changes to your library data, come back to Word and hit that little refresh button. And that will force Zotero and Word to do a quick check. And there I now see my article title looks more in compliance with APA. The fact that it only took a couple seconds to fix that is testament to how quickly you can make things right dealing with this. But sometimes you don't need an entire paper. So let's just make a nice blank. Actually, let's go to Zotero itself. So let's say I'm just making a list of all my stuff. Instead of having to go through the task of writing and citing and doing all that to get the bibliographic entry, maybe all you're doing is an annotated bibliography. Maybe you're just doing a list of resources. Maybe you're dumping it into a syllabus. I don't know. I can highlight things in Zotero, right click, or on a Mac, two-finger click, Apple click, or is it command click? Whatever. I can create bibliography from items. I get to choose my style. Again, I do like me some APA. And I'm going to copy to clipboard because now I can paste this anywhere. Like a brand new Word document. Ta-da! Super quick, super easy. Is this something I would use for a paper? No, never. Is this something I would use for an annotated bibliography? Heck yeah. I might need to change some of the rules for hanging indents and stuff like that. But in terms of a quick, nice looking list, this is pretty sweet. Ultimately, these are things that work best when you have already paved the way by getting everything into Zotero, engaging with more worthwhile academic resources, databases from EBSCO, ProQuest, and elsewhere. And if you run into problems, let your librarians know. Speaking of support, Zotero is free, and free, oddly enough, has a cost all its own. There is no direct tech support from Zotero. Zotero is its own thing. And yeah, I've never really gotten a reply back to any email I sent them, which is a shame. Anyway, that's okay. You've got the libraries. If you are running into problems, reach out to your librarians, reach out to our library staff. We will do our best to assist you. We may not have the perfect answer, but we try to help you out because honestly, failure in this space can be genuinely catastrophic, especially if you're facing, say, a PhD dissertation, a massive manuscript submission, and suddenly everything goes completely bonkers. Definitely ask us. If the question is time sensitive, i.e., you are going to reach out for assistance immediately and not even waste a second, I mean, email us, get in contact with us. That's a good idea. But also go to the documentation portion of the Zotero website, look for Zotero videos, get as much help as you can. If that means being active and showing initiative, so be it. We'll still try to reach out to you, but if it's time sensitive, it's time sensitive. Just go. All right. What else we got? Ah, yes. Syncing and group libraries. These are some of the more advanced features, so we're going to touch on those and then we're going to wrap up. All right, syncing. To sync, you first must register. You have to have a Zotero account in order to sync your local Zotero library with the Zotero servers. Now, as you might imagine, that might demand actually registering, but it's not really, there's no obvious registration button or anything on the Zotero website, which is weird. I don't know why they do this. Like it's anyway, sorry. My complaints aside, click on login and then register for a free account. If you are going to register for a free account, I highly recommend using your Mason email account. You do not have to use the same password as your regular Mason accounts elsewhere with the university because this is separate. However, Mason and Zotero have an understanding. Using your Mason email will allow you to enjoy some of those more robust features that have already been secured for you, specifically unlimited online storage. How do I know that it's there? Well, I'm going to show you my own account page in just one quick second. Here we have the Zotero settings page. And if I go to storage, we have this lovely little bit here, institutional storage, meaning so long as you are using your Mason email as your primary email, you've got unlimited storage online. I don't know how long this is going to go on for. I hope it's perpetual, but dang it, if it's not nice to enjoy it for as long as we do. Now, creating the account is just step one of the entire effort. Now we need to connect our local Zotero program to our account. If you've ever like synced up any kind of Google or Apple product, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So here's my Zotero library. Now, again, because we can't have nice things, your preferences menu might be somewhere different. In a Windows environment, I believe it's under, did they put it under? Yes, they put it under edit. I think it might also be under edit or the Zotero menu option on Mac OS, all the same. This is the setting menu, and there is my data syncing option. You can see it on the left in these tabs. There it is. And there we go. It's done. Now, just setting that up by itself is fine. If you haven't ever done it before, there's not much to really do. However, if you already have a robust synced library, and maybe you got a new computer, you got a new job, you got a new laptop, and you're trying to make sure everything fits, the synced button in the Zotero program is right there. And here we can see all my group libraries showing up. I'll talk about those in one quick second. And yeah, all my stuff is going to start coming down. It can take a while depending on just how much stuff you have. Don't worry, it'll work just fine. Now, while that is churning away, I'm going to talk about group libraries. Group libraries are something you can do once you have registered and once you have synced. If you are, for any reason, going to be engaging with a group project, these can be very useful. Now, when I say group project, I don't mean like a group project for one semester or something like that. I'm talking about a much larger, longer term group effort. This might be more for the faculty out there, maybe the staff, the grad students, um, because dealing with this is work. Because whoever is running this thing is going to be the administrator of a group library, and that can be a pain in the butt. So, all the same, I'm going to create a group. The group name has to be unique. So, whatever that might be, I'll go with that. Public, public, private. If you're not sure which of these to choose, I would default to public closed or private. Public open means that your group will show up on a public listing. Actually, you can see the little field to search those right there, and people can join as they like. And they can, yeah, that doesn't sound too bad until you have people suddenly stumble across your group and join in without any reason and start messing stuff up. Public close means you show up on the group listing, but people have to apply to actually join or have to be invited to. Private is probably the least overtly public facing. You're not going to be on the public listing and you have to invite people to join. But all the same, once you've created a group, you can then start managing it. So I'll use one of my older groups as an example. Dinglehopper 1. I made this many years ago. I thought the name was funny. I've been told later that it was not. Anyway, here's the group. The group library is one thing, but the group settings are quite another. Here you can put in a description with all kinds of HTML markup as one likes. You can mark the discipline. You can create a link to a external website away from Zotero. You can enable comments. Okay, why would anybody do that in this day and age? I don't know. As the owner, you can delete the group. You can add a profile picture, lots of options. Member settings is where the actual administration really starts to hit because everyone has to be invited. And there are 3 different layers of authority: member, admin, and owner. There is only ever one owner, and the rest are members or admin. Oddly, they've never created a better website for this. The send more invitations link is down here below member invitations, where you can then get this lovely little box to put in people's email, or if you have them, there's Zotero usernames to then send out email member invitations that you can then pester people about until they accept and they move up here, and they are now fully part of the group. Library settings are broadly self-explanatory, nothing particularly exciting here. You can change the group type at will. You can change who can or cannot find your group's library online to ultimately read the material or see what sources you have. The last 2 options are probably the most significant because it changes what people can do in the group library. Library editing, who can actually do like the add item and add entries, and file editing, who can add PDFs, who's going to dump file attachments into Zotero, which you can do. Broadly speaking, if you trust everybody, any group, perfectly fine. However, maybe you have someone that can't be trusted with anything. You might make them a member and elevate everyone up to group admin, or maybe everyone else is going to be a member. Maybe it's a class project where all of your undergrads have to look at this library, but you don't want them to mess it up. So they'll all be members. You'll be the admin, whatever you got to do. In terms of actually working with this, I'm going to pop back over to Zotero. It is still churning away, but here are some, actually, I'll make this bigger. Here are my group libraries. You can see these on the left. I can have things in multiple places. So my library up here is my library and my library alone. No one else can see it. No one else can mess with it. That's how I like it. Elsewhere, I will have other libraries that I have joined, and this will represent a wide range of materials that I can then like potentially move from here to my library, or from my library. Actually, let's take these things and move them to a group library to share. As I save things, I can direct them to the group library for others in my group to ultimately see and potentially read and make use of. In terms of having a single shared body of material to base your work on, this is actually kind of nice. If that appeals, by all means, engage with this. If it doesn't, that's okay. None of this is required. This is all extra. If you run into challenges with any of this, please let us know. Speaking of, time to wrap it up. If you're running into trouble, please email us, email me, reach out to the library directly, give them a call. There are question forms on the page. It doesn't matter how you ask for help, just ask. Is the Zotero connector not working? Are the resources you're pulling in, the PDFs just aren't working? Is EBSCO being jerky about giving you more than one thing at a time? Is your group library suddenly imploding? Reach out, sooner the better, to help you get past whatever obstacle there might be, or honestly, from time to time, to give you the unfortunate word you need to know in order to get beyond it and start working on something else. This can really make significantly, I'll call it, emotionally significant moments, i.e., finishing up a paper, a little bit easier to deal with. It'll make it less bad. And honestly, that's all we can really ask for. Thank you all very much for your time. Have a good day.